At dawn, the lake lay still as glass, untouched by even the faintest breeze. Leonard Thomas pulled into the gravel lot beside the tranquil water, the old memories of his father teaching him to fish flickering in his mind like faint ripples across the surface. At 47, Leonard savored the promise of this early morning, his aluminum boat freshly polished, his thermos of hot coffee warm in his hand. It wasn't just a fishing trip. It was a return to a place where quiet felt like home. But his peace was shattered by the sound of sharp footsteps on gravel. A woman, clipboard in hand, approached with the authority of a small-town marshal, short, blonde, and armed with a dismissive smile. She barked out, "You can't park that boat here." Confused but calm, Leonard replied, "Good morning. Are you a resident here?" The woman, Veronica Mitchell, shot back, "I'm on the HOA board. You're not on the list of approved lake users. You need to move your boat." Leonard's pulse stayed steady. "I've fished here for years. There's no problem." But Veronica wasn't listening. Her gaze held not just irritation but something deeper. Something that dismissed Leonard entirely without asking a single question. She declared he was trespassing, ready to call the sheriff. Leonard let her talk, the weight of his family's legacy, of his father's quiet strength, settling into his bones. What Veronica didn't realize was that Leonard wasn't just a visitor. He was the lake's owner, its protector, and the one person who could decide its future. As he watched her scribble his name like he was an intruder, he knew this wasn't just about fishing. It was about respect, and he wasn't about to let it go unanswered. The morning sun barely crested the treetops as Leonard Thomas stepped out of his truck and into the quiet hum of Mayfield Lake. He had been waiting weeks for this moment, a chance to fish on the waters his father once called home. The lake, with its glassy surface and gentle morning air, was more than just a fishing spot. It was a piece of his family's legacy. But that serenity was broken by the sharp approach of Veronica Mitchell. Her clipboard clutched like a sword, her voice laced with unearned authority. "You can't park that boat here," she snapped, her tone cold and dismissive. Leonard, still calm, looked at her and asked, "Are you a resident here?" "I'm on the HOA board," she answered proudly, "and you're not on the list of permitted lake users. This lake is private. Move your boat or I'll call the authorities." Leonard felt a mixture of frustration and quiet resolve settle in his chest. He wasn't just an outsider, he was the owner of the entire lake. His father had left it to him, trusting Leonard to honor the same principles of respect and shared space that had guided them for generations. The fishing club that Veronica represented had only ever been allowed access through a handshake agreement, one that had expired long ago but had continued out of courtesy. Yet here she was, accusing him of trespassing, ignoring not just his identity but the history he carried. He stayed calm, knowing that shouting back would only feed her power trip. "Are you sure you want to push this?" he asked her softly, watching as uncertainty flickered in her eyes. "You might want to check your facts." But Veronica didn't listen. She doubled down, threatening to have him removed and citing her so-called authority. Leonard let her call the sheriff if she wanted. He had the paperwork to prove the truth. As the sun rose higher, he cast his line into the water, choosing not to let her hostility ruin his morning. Yet, inside, he felt the weight of her assumptions, the entitlement that had seeped into the community, the way some people assumed ownership of space not through deeds or respect but through volume and arrogance. Back home, Leonard sat at his kitchen table, the old deed and trust documents spread out before him. His father's careful handwriting and signatures told a story that no clipboard could erase. The lake was his, the access given to the community a courtesy, not a right. He called his lawyer, reviewed the terms, and drafted a letter addressed to the HOA. It wasn't about revenge or spite, it was about respect. He calmly outlined the terms of the original agreement, pointing out the expired access permissions and notifying them that, effective immediately, public access would be suspended until a proper review and new terms were agreed upon. The fallout was immediate. Veronica's bluster turned to frantic whispers as board members scrambled to contain the situation. Some neighbors quietly supported Leonard, recognizing that he had every right to do what he was doing. Others were outraged, blinded by a sense of entitlement that made them forget the lake was never theirs to claim. But Leonard stood firm. When the emergency HOA meeting convened, he attended, standing calmly at the front of the room. He spoke not with anger but with clarity, reminding them of the history of the lake, the trust his father placed in the community, and how that trust had been broken. He wasn't asking for anything unreasonable, just for respect, for acknowledgement, and for a new understanding of what shared space really meant. By the time the meeting ended, something had shifted. Leonard hadn't yelled, he hadn't threatened, he had stood firm and let the truth speak for itself. And slowly, one by one, the community began to understand that respect is not something demanded by volume or clipboard authority, but earned by action and integrity. Leonard left that night knowing he had done right by his father, and by himself. As the sun painted golden streaks across the water of Mayfield Lake, Leonard Thomas stood still, feeling a quiet but powerful resolve settle in his chest. The confrontation with Veronica Mitchell a few days earlier was not just an annoying interruption. It was a stark reminder of entitlement wrapped in the pretense of authority. Veronica, with her tight grip on her clipboard and her clipped words, had dismissed him as if he were an interloper on his own land. But Leonard wasn't just anyone with a boat. He was the rightful owner of the lake. A legacy passed down from his father, a man who believed in shared spaces built on mutual respect. The fishing club's access, once granted as a gesture of goodwill, had been treated as an entitlement. And now, after Veronica's public power play, it was time for Leonard to draw a line. Back at home, Leonard sat at his kitchen table, the familiar creak of the old wooden chair grounding him. He unfolded the original trust documents, signed and sealed with care by his father and the previous landowners. The paperwork made it clear. The lake was under the stewardship of Crescent Holdings, with Leonard as the sole trustee. The community's fishing privileges were a courtesy, renewable by mutual agreement, not an unearned right, but no renewal had been requested. And Veronica's dismissive attitude had made one thing clear: this was no longer about paperwork. It was about respect. Leonard drafted a letter to the HOA board, direct and professional, not with spite but with clarity. Effective immediately, he wrote, access to the lake would be suspended until proper discussions and agreements were made. He attached the deed and trust documents, highlighting the community's lapse in maintaining the terms of the agreement. The letter wasn't a threat, it was a boundary. The reaction was swift and telling. Whispers turned into panicked phone calls. Emails with veiled frustration landed in his inbox. Some neighbors quietly voiced support, recognizing Leonard's right to act. Others, particularly Veronica and her circle, fumed, their entitlement rattled by the reminder that ownership isn't determined by volume or assumption. Leonard's phone rang incessantly, with calls ranging from passive-aggressive to outright confrontational. Yet, through it all, he remained calm. His father had always taught him that dignity in the face of disrespect speaks louder than any shouted words. When the emergency HOA meeting was called, Leonard attended, not to gloat, not to stir the pot, but to speak his truth. Dressed simply, he stood near the front of the room, his voice steady as he recounted the lake's history and the values his father had instilled in him. He reminded them that the access had always been a privilege, not a right, and that the trust in the community's stewardship had been eroded by negligence and entitlement. He wasn't there to punish the community, he was there to reclaim respect. Not just for himself but for his father's legacy. A hush fell over the room as Leonard spoke. Even Veronica's usual sharpness seemed dulled, her crossed arms loosening ever so slightly. Some residents met Leonard's gaze for the first time, realizing that this wasn't just about fishing access or property lines. It was about fairness and dignity. When Leonard finished, he didn't expect applause or immediate agreement. What he hoped for was understanding. A seed of reflection planted in a community that had grown too comfortable with its assumptions. As he left the meeting, Leonard felt lighter, not because the conflict was over, It wasn't, but because he had reclaimed his voice. The following days were quieter, with fewer confrontations and more cautious conversations. The lake, once a backdrop to entitlement and disregard, was now a symbol of something more profound. The quiet strength it takes to stand firm without anger. To let actions and truth speak where noise fails. Leonard knew it wasn't the end of the story, but it was a beginning. A reminder that true respect isn't given, it's earned. One clear boundary at a time. In the early light of dawn, Leonard Thomas stood at the water's edge of Mayfield Lake, the same lake his father had once taught him to fish as a child. His reflection in the still surface mirrored the steadiness he had learned from years of quiet observation and patience. Just days ago, Veronica Mitchell, with her overbearing clipboard and false authority, had confronted him, her tone dismissive and laced with assumptions. She had acted as though his presence, his right to be on his own property, was something she could revoke with a few clipped words. But Leonard knew better. The lake was his, not by arrogance, but by documented legacy and ownership. His father had once spoken of how entitlement without respect was a dangerous combination. And now Leonard saw his father's words play out in real time. Returning home after that confrontation, Leonard sat at his worn kitchen table, pulling out the trust papers that confirmed his legal rights to the lake. The papers were more than dry legal documents. They were a testament to a relationship of respect between his family and the community. His father had generously allowed the neighborhood access to the lake, expecting only care and mutual respect in return. But over time, entitlement replaced gratitude. The fishing club hadn't renewed its access agreement, and no one had even asked. Veronica's arrogance was just the tip of the iceberg. Leonard knew this wasn't about enforcing property rights for the sake of it. It was about restoring a balance that had been quietly tipping out of line. With a calm and deliberate hand, he drafted a letter to the HOA board. It was not filled with threats or anger, but with clarity and evidence. He included scanned copies of the trust documents and deed, explicitly stating that effective immediately, community access to the lake was suspended until a new, respectful agreement could be reached. The letter was firm yet professional, a clear assertion of his right to control access to his family's legacy. As he mailed the letter, he felt no malice, only a determination to restore respect where it had been lost. The neighborhood's reaction was swift. Whispers turned into heated phone calls. His inbox filled with emails, some polite but insistent, others veiled with frustration. Some neighbors, like Billy Waller, approached him quietly, expressing support and understanding, acknowledging that Veronica's behavior did not represent them all. But others, particularly those close to the HOA's inner circle, fumed. Rumors swirled that Leonard was being spiteful, even plotting to sell the lake to private developers. But Leonard remained unmoved. He knew that silence and dignity often spoke louder than confrontation. When the emergency HOA meeting was called, Leonard decided to attend. He didn't come armed with harsh words or accusations. Instead, he stood at the front of the room, wearing a simple button-down shirt and jeans. Speaking with the steady calm his father would have admired, he shared the story of the lake, how it had been a place of learning, patience, and shared joy for generations. He explained how the access agreement had lapsed not through his neglect, but through the community's entitlement and disregard for the trust that had once been built. His voice was steady, not seeking to punish, but to remind everyone of the values that had been lost in the noise of assumption and arrogance. As he spoke, Leonard noticed a shift in the room. Some neighbors who had only seen him as a silent figure by the lake now saw him as a man of principle and quiet strength. Even Veronica's posture softened, though she didn't offer an apology. When the meeting ended, Leonard left with his head held high, knowing that the foundation had been laid for a more respectful future. The following days were quieter, with fewer confrontations and a growing sense that the community was beginning to reflect on its own behavior. On a quiet Saturday morning, Leonard returned to the lake, not with the intent to fish, but to repair the broken benches and fencing himself. He wasn't fixing the space for the neighborhood. He was doing it for his father, for the memories they had shared, and for the values that mattered most. As he worked, Andrea Preston, a new HOA member, approached with a cordless drill and an offer to help. It was a small gesture, but one that signaled change. Leonard realized that respect wasn't about demanding compliance or submission. It was about leading with quiet strength and integrity, showing by example how to restore balance and understanding. This wasn't just about a lake. It was about a legacy, and Leonard was ready to protect it, one steady action at a time. At the heart of the conflict at Mayfield Lake was not just a misunderstanding of property rights. It was a clash of entitlement and quiet resilience. Leonard Thomas, a man of unshakable calm and quiet dignity, found himself at the center of this storm, not because he sought power or confrontation, but because someone else decided his presence didn't belong. After Veronica Mitchell's audacious attempt to force him from the lake, a place his family had owned for generations, Leonard's response was not one of rage or dramatic gestures. Instead, it was measured and purposeful. He gathered the necessary documents, reviewed the trust agreements his father had left behind, and began the deliberate process of reclaiming respect, both for himself and the legacy of Mayfield Lake. The public reaction was swift and polarized. Some neighbors, conditioned by years of assumption, whispered accusations of power grabs in retaliation. But others, like Billy Waller, saw through the noise and approached Leonard with quiet words of support. They recognized the deeper issue. This wasn't about a boat or a fishing club. It was about standing up to entitlement and reminding a community of the importance of gratitude and stewardship. Despite the mounting pressure, Leonard stayed calm. He drafted a formal letter to the HOA, revoking community access to the lake pending a respectful renegotiation. His message was clear, firm, and backed by legal documentation, not a threat, but a reminder of the boundaries that had been crossed. What Leonard understood, and what many in the neighborhood failed to grasp, was that respect isn't a given. It isn't a favor granted to those who shout the loudest or wield clipboards with misplaced authority. Respect is earned through actions, through the way we treat others when no one is watching, through the integrity we bring to our roles as neighbors, caretakers, and human beings. Leonard's father had believed in sharing the lake because it fostered community and connection. But over time, that generosity had been taken for granted, replaced by entitlement and a sense of ownership that had no basis in reality. Leonard wasn't trying to reclaim the lake out of spite. He was trying to restore the balance of respect that had been lost. As the tension grew and HOA meetings were called, Leonard didn't shy away. He attended, not to confront or accuse, but to share his story. He spoke about his father, about the lessons learned by the water's edge, about the silent dignity of doing what's right even when it's hard. His words didn't stir immediate applause or dramatic gestures of reconciliation, but they did something more powerful. They made people pause. They made them reflect on their own actions, their assumptions, and the quiet harm caused by overlooking the humanity of others. Even Veronica, once so sure of her authority, found herself silent, her stance softening as she realized the weight of her assumptions. In the days that followed, Leonard's steady example sparked a subtle shift. Andrea Preston, a newer and more thoughtful voice on the HOA board, reached out to discuss a new agreement, one grounded in mutual respect and clear responsibilities. Billy Waller and his grandson showed up to help with cleanup efforts around the lake, signaling a quiet apology and a step toward rebuilding community trust. And Leonard, through it all, remained true to his father's values, that standing firm with quiet dignity can resonate louder than any argument. And that sometimes, the most profound change begins with one person refusing to be diminished. In the end, Leonard didn't win a battle. He restored balance. The lake wasn't just water and shoreline. It was a symbol of what happens when respect is eroded and what it takes to rebuild it. Plank by plank, conversation by conversation, the neighborhood might not have issued a formal apology, but in their softened tones, their new willingness to listen, and their quiet gestures of support, Leonard found something even more valuable: the beginning of understanding and, perhaps, a genuine respect for the legacy he had quietly protected all along. The quiet air of Mayfield Lake seemed to shimmer with renewed tension as Leonard Thomas made his decision, a decision that would echo across the entire neighborhood, transforming not just relationships, but the very understanding of ownership and respect. After years of silent patience and generosity, Leonard, armed with the proper legal documentation, formally revoked the community's access to the lake his family had stewarded for decades. This action was not driven by pettiness or revenge. It was a necessary response to the growing entitlement that had been simmering just beneath the surface. When Veronica Mitchell, with her clipboard and air of authority, had confronted Leonard at the lake, she hadn't just challenged his presence, she had dismissed his identity, his family's legacy, and his rights as a property owner. And in doing so, she had exposed a deep, unspoken rift in the community. The revocation notice, though professional and straightforward, sparked a wildfire of reactions. Neighbors who had once enjoyed the tranquil shores and fishing spots without a second thought found themselves divided. Some whispered accusations of Leonard being vindictive, claiming he was disrupting a long-standing tradition. Others, like Andrea Preston and Billy Waller, recognized the uncomfortable truth that the community had grown too comfortable, too entitled, and had forgotten the simple courtesy of gratitude and stewardship. As the days passed, Leonard's resolve remained steady. He attended HOA meetings, listened quietly, and when it was his turn to speak, he recounted the lake's history, not with anger, but with clarity and dignity. He spoke of his father's values, the hard-earned trust of the old days, and the importance of recognizing when a privilege becomes a presumed right. His words rippled through the room, forcing even Veronica to shift in her seat, her certainty faltering under the weight of her own assumptions. Leonard's approach, measured, calm, and backed by irrefutable facts, left little room for argument. It was no longer just about the lake. It was about the community's collective failure to see the human being behind the property lines. Leonard didn't demand apologies or concessions. Instead, he asked for recognition. Recognition that respect isn't given freely, that it's something earned through actions and maintained through mutual understanding. His quiet strength made it clear that standing firm, without shouting or threats, could command more respect than any loud declaration of ownership ever could. As word of the revocation spread, it ignited a series of private conversations and public debates. Letters appeared in mailboxes, online forums buzzed with speculation, and the once quiet streets of Mayfield Hills became corridors of whispered opinions. Some residents reached out to Leonard directly, offering apologies, sharing stories of their own family connections to the lake, and expressing a newfound appreciation for what he had maintained all these years. Others clung to their resentment, unable or unwilling to acknowledge their part in the erosion of neighborly respect. But amidst the turmoil, something subtle began to shift. The lake, once taken for granted, started to feel different in the minds of the residents. It became a symbol not just of a place to fish or picnic, but of the delicate balance between generosity and entitlement, between silence and action. Leonard's decision to enforce the lake's access terms wasn't an act of isolation. It was a call for accountability. And it wasn't long before Andrea, representing the newer, more reflective side of the HOA, reached out with a proposal for a revised agreement. This time, the terms were clear: scheduled maintenance, a 3-strike policy for littering, mandatory orientations for lake users, and above all, an annual renewal process that recognized Leonard's role as steward of the land. Leonard didn't agree immediately. He let the weight of the community's silence settle, waiting to see if their actions would align with their words. When the revised agreement arrived on his doorstep, it wasn't just a piece of paper. It was an acknowledgement of past mistakes and a commitment to a future built on respect, not assumption. In the end, Leonard's quiet insistence on dignity reshaped more than just lake access. It taught his neighbors the invaluable lesson that respect isn't a right, it's a responsibility. And when it's taken for granted, it must be re-earned. not through grand gestures, but through steady, honest action. In the quiet shadows of Mayfield Lake, Leonard Thomas stood by the water's edge, reflecting not just on the placid surface of the lake but on the ripples that had spread through the entire community. What had begun as a simple, unwelcome confrontation, Veronica Mitchell, clipboard in hand, accusing him of trespassing on his own property, had evolved into a reckoning of respect, boundaries, and the true meaning of ownership. Leonard hadn't responded with anger, though it would have been justified. Instead, he relied on facts, dignity, and the quiet strength his father had instilled in him during those long-ago fishing trips. His decision to suspend community access to the lake wasn't driven by vengeance but by a deep-seated belief that respect must be mutual, and privileges granted shouldn't be mistaken for entitlements. The neighborhood's response was immediate and telling. Whispers in grocery aisles, anonymous flyers slipped into mailboxes, and hastily convened HOA meetings all pointed to the same underlying tension, an assumption that access to the lake was theirs by right, not by the courtesy Leonard's family had extended for years. But as Leonard calmly laid out the documented facts, deeds, agreements, legal rights, the narrative shifted. His refusal to be cowed by Veronica's assumptions forced the neighborhood to confront its own complacency. People who had barely acknowledged Leonard's presence now found themselves grappling with the reality that the lake was not a communal birthright but a privilege maintained through his stewardship. Andrea Preston's emergence as a voice of reason within the HOA was a turning point. Her recognition of the need for clear terms, maintenance responsibilities, and genuine communication was a stark contrast to Veronica's bluster. When she approached Leonard with a revised agreement that emphasized respect, accountability, and shared responsibility, it wasn't just a formality, it was an admission that the old way of doing things had failed. Leonard's measured response, reading the proposal, weighing its sincerity, spoke volumes about his integrity. He wasn't seeking control for its own sake. He wanted assurance that the community had learned from its missteps and was willing to rebuild trust on solid ground. As the days turned into weeks, the atmosphere around the lake changed. Teenagers who once loitered near the shoreline now hesitated, waiting for permission. Residents who had taken Leonard's generosity for granted began to approach him with cautious gratitude or silent nods of acknowledgement. The whispers turned into conversations, some awkward, some genuine. Leonard, for his part, maintained his quiet watch over the lake, tending to repairs not out of obligation but out of love for the place that had shaped his childhood. He knew the true value of the lake wasn't in its water or its fish but in the lessons it taught, about patience, about legacy, and about the quiet power of standing firm. When Leonard finally agreed to sign the revised access agreement, it wasn't a concession, it was a carefully considered choice. The terms were clear, the boundaries respected, and the community's renewed understanding of its role was evident. His signature wasn't just ink on paper, it was a symbol of reconciliation, a bridge between entitlement and gratitude. The sight of teenagers thanking him, of Billy Waller and his grandson helping clear the trail, of Andrea standing shoulder to shoulder with him as they repaired the dock. All these moments wove together into a tapestry of quiet transformation. Leonard's story, though rooted in a small Missouri community, resonated far beyond its borders. It became a testament to the idea that true change doesn't come from loud declarations or public shaming but from steadfast principles, respectful dialogue, and the courage to stand one's ground. His choice to act not with anger but with grace redefined his neighbors' understanding of what it means to belong, not to a place, but to each other. And as the sun rose over Mayfield Lake one still morning, it wasn't just a new day for the community, it was a reminder that sometimes the greatest strength lies not in forcing respect but in earning it, one quiet act at a time. On a crisp Sunday morning, Leonard Thomas stood at the edge of Mayfield Lake, the sun's first light painting gentle ripples across the water's surface. The conflict that had ignited between him and the Mayfield Hills Homeowners Association felt distant now, though its echoes still lingered in the community's strained nods and cautious glances. What had begun as a simple outing to fish in familiar waters had spiraled into a public confrontation, sparked by Veronica Mitchell's loud, misguided assertion that Leonard was trespassing. But as the weeks unfolded, Leonard's quiet strength and unwavering adherence to the truth transformed not just the narrative but the entire neighborhood. Leonard's decision to suspend the community's access to the lake had been met with resistance, angry calls, whispers of entitlement, and even anonymous flyers accusing him of a power grab. Yet amidst the noise, a shift had begun. His actions weren't about retribution, they were about restoring respect, reminding neighbors that privileges are not rights and that stewardship of something precious demands recognition. The quiet dignity with which Leonard navigated the tension drew a stark contrast to Veronica's abrasive posturing, making it clear that the real disruption hadn't been Leonard's presence but the community's unexamined assumptions. As the days passed, a sense of reckoning settled over Mayfield Hills. Leonard's firm yet fair stance forced residents to confront their own complacency. Whispers turned into conversations, some tinged with defensiveness, others with genuine curiosity. Andrea Preston's emergence as a voice of reason within the HOA marked a turning point. Her acknowledgement of the board's failure to renew the access agreement, coupled with her willingness to draft a revised proposal, demonstrated a newfound willingness to listen and learn. When she approached Leonard with the updated agreement, it wasn't a hollow gesture, it was a sincere attempt to rebuild trust and establish clear, respectful boundaries. Leonard's response was thoughtful and measured. He wasn't interested in dominance or punishment. What mattered was the integrity of the process, the clarity of terms, the commitment to maintenance, and the community's genuine understanding of its responsibilities. His signature on the revised agreement wasn't a capitulation, it was a bridge. A signal that he was willing to move forward with neighbors who were ready to acknowledge past mistakes and work toward a more respectful future. In the weeks that followed, the lake's atmosphere shifted. Teenagers who once loitered on the shore with fishing poles now approached Leonard with cautious respect, asking permission or simply offering a nod of acknowledgement. Longtime residents like Billy Waller and his grandson Lucas volunteered to help clean up the shoreline. Not because they were asked but because they recognized the value of Leonard's quiet stewardship. The community began to see Leonard not as an obstacle but as a guardian of something shared and cherished. The entitlement that had fueled Veronica's initial confrontation gave way to a collective realization. The lake's legacy wasn't just a matter of convenience, it was a symbol of respect and cooperation. The most profound change, however, wasn't visible in the lake's renewed tidiness or the revised agreement's legal precision. It was in the way people approached each other, in the way neighbors began to see Leonard as more than just a name on a deed. At the next HOA meeting, Leonard stood at the front of the room, calm and steady. He spoke not of legalities or grievances but of values, of how his father had taught him to care for the lake, of how respect was earned through actions, not demanded through titles. His words resonated with those who listened, sparking a conversation that went beyond property lines and HOA rules. It was about the kind of community they wanted to be. As Leonard walked back to his truck that evening, a few neighbors offered quiet thanks, and one teenager, hat askew and fishing pole in hand, gave him a shy smile. Leonard knew the work wasn't done. Respect had to be maintained, nurtured like the lake itself. But for the first time since that fateful Saturday morning, he felt a sense of peace, not because he had won a battle, but because he had reminded a community of something deeper, that standing firm with dignity and truth can inspire others to do the same. Early one cool Saturday morning, Leonard Thomas once again backed his old fishing boat into the gravel lot at Mayfield Lake. This time, though, the air felt different. The past weeks had seen a wave of change ripple through the neighborhood. What started as a tense confrontation, sparked by Veronica Mitchell's misguided assertion of authority, had evolved into something more profound, a quiet shift in how the community viewed not just Leonard but the lake itself. After the public standoff, where Veronica demanded Leonard leave community property, The realization slowly dawned on residents that Leonard wasn't an intruder at all. He was, in fact, the rightful trustee of the lake, a legacy he had inherited and honored in memory of his father. That morning, as he stepped onto the familiar dock, Leonard felt not the weight of conflict but a sense of restored calm. Neighbors who once passed him in silence or suspicion now offered hesitant nods or brief waves. It wasn't complete acceptance, but it was a start. The revised lake access agreement, born from the confrontation, had been finalized with clear guidelines, maintenance commitments, and an annual review process. Gone were the days of assumed entitlement and unspoken expectations. The new structure wasn't about exclusion, it was about mutual respect and shared responsibility. Leonard's role was no longer that of an unseen benefactor. He had become a visible steward of a communal space, one whose quiet strength demanded acknowledgement. Billy Waller and his grandson Lucas were already by the shore that morning, picking up stray pieces of trash and reinforcing the trail's edge with fresh gravel. Leonard offered a simple nod of appreciation, and Billy, in his usual down-to-earth manner, grinned. "Thought we'd give you a head start today," he said. Lucas, shy but determined, added, "Granddad says this lake's worth taking care of." Leonard agreed quietly, recognizing in the boy the same spark of responsibility that his own father had instilled in him decades before. As more neighbors trickled down to the water's edge, the shift in atmosphere became palpable. No longer did the lake symbolize a battleground between individual rights and collective entitlement. Instead, it stood as a testament to the power of standing firm, not with aggression or loud declarations, but with quiet conviction. Andrea Preston, the new voice of reason within the HOA, approached Leonard with a clipboard and a freshly printed copy of the finalized agreement. "It's official," she said, her tone light but genuine. "We're ready to move forward. On the right terms this time." Leonard glanced over the document, nodding in approval before signing. There were no grand speeches, no forced smiles, just a shared understanding that something fundamental had shifted. That afternoon, Leonard watched as teenagers fished near the shore, carefully packing up their gear when they left, leaving the area cleaner than they found it. Couples strolled by, some offering brief nods, others lingering to exchange a few words of thanks. Even those who had once whispered about Leonard behind his back now seemed to regard him with a quiet respect. The hostility that had colored those early confrontations was fading, replaced by an unspoken acknowledgement of the truth Leonard had so patiently upheld. The lake, once at the center of a neighborhood dispute, had become a symbol of community resilience and the importance of earning respect through actions rather than demands. Leonard's decision to stand firm, to let the facts and the law speak for themselves, had reminded everyone that true ownership isn't just about holding a deed. It's about embodying the values that make a place worth preserving. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the dock, Leonard felt a rare moment of peace. He knew the road ahead would still require vigilance and quiet leadership. But he also knew, deep down, that Mayfield Lake was no longer just a body of water. It had become a space where respect was not just given but earned, where silence spoke louder than confrontation, and where a man's steady presence could inspire a community to finally listen. On a breezy Saturday morning, Leonard Thomas stood on the edge of Mayfield Lake, his breath mixing with the mist rising from the water. It had been weeks since Veronica Mitchell's failed attempt to remove him from the lake's edge, accusing him of trespassing without realizing he was the actual owner. That confrontation, which could have turned hostile, had instead sparked a deep and necessary conversation within the community. Now, standing on the dock he had helped repair, Leonard felt a rare sense of clarity. The waves lapped gently against the boat he'd just secured, the quiet punctuated only by the occasional bird call and the distant laughter of children playing. This was what the lake was always meant to be, a peaceful sanctuary, not a battleground for misguided authority and entitlement. In the days following the initial confrontation, Leonard had witnessed a profound shift in the neighborhood's attitude. Conversations that once avoided his presence now included his voice. Strangers who previously offered only side glances and tight-lipped greetings now nodded with recognition. Sometimes even gratitude. The new lake access agreement, meticulously revised and strengthened, had been a testament to this transformation. It wasn't just about legal rights anymore, it was about respect and mutual understanding. Clear terms had been set, a maintenance schedule established, and a process for renewing access codified. Most importantly, the agreement included an orientation to educate members about the lake's history and Leonard's role as its steward. No longer would the lake be seen as an entitlement, it would be appreciated as a privilege. One that demanded care and respect. Leonard's quiet resolve had inspired more than just procedural changes. Andrea Preston, now a leading voice within the HOA, had emerged as an ally, facilitating discussions that were long overdue. Together, they had navigated through heated board meetings, drafted revised policies, and diffused rumors that threatened to undermine the fragile trust rebuilding within the community. Leonard's decision to stand firm yet patient had proven more effective than any argument. His silence had spoken volumes, demonstrating that dignity and truth could reshape even the most entrenched perceptions. That afternoon, as Leonard prepared to leave the lake, a small group of neighbors approached. Among them was a teenage boy, his hands stuffed into his jacket pockets, glancing nervously at the ground. "Mr. Thomas," he said, voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "My dad told me what you did. About standing your ground. I just wanted to say, I think that was brave." Leonard felt a warmth bloom in his chest, an affirmation that his actions had rippled far beyond the water's edge. He gave the boy a nod and a quiet, "Thank you." It wasn't much, but it was enough. As the sun dipped lower, casting long golden streaks across the lake, Leonard knew that the journey wasn't over. Respect wasn't a destination, it was a continuous practice, one that required patience, empathy, and the willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. The lake, once a symbol of conflict, now reflected a community learning to listen, to consider, and to grow. Leonard had become more than a property owner, he had become a catalyst for change. A quiet leader who reminded his neighbors that real power lies not in assertion but in understanding. In that moment, standing at the water's edge, Leonard wasn't thinking about legal documents, revised agreements, or HOA politics. He was thinking about his father, the man who first taught him to fish on this very lake, and the legacy of respect and stewardship that now rested on his shoulders. He was thinking about the boy who found the courage to speak up, the neighbors who finally looked him in the eye, and the path forward, one paved not by entitlement but by genuine connection. As he packed up his gear and stepped onto the trail, he felt a quiet conviction settle over him. This wasn't just his lake, it was a place where respect had been reclaimed, not demanded. And in that simple truth, Leonard found peace. Underneath the golden haze of a late autumn afternoon, Leonard Thomas sat quietly on the weathered bench by Mayfield Lake, watching as the sunlight played across the still water. It had been weeks since the confrontation with Veronica Mitchell and the heated meetings with the HOA board. But today, for the first time in a long while, the lake was calm in more ways than one. Leonard wasn't here to check documents or enforce agreements. He was simply here to sit, to listen to the soft rustle of leaves, and to let the quiet heal him. In the distance, the faint laughter of children echoed across the water, a sound that had once seemed at odds with the tension that gripped the community but now signaled something deeper, a return to normalcy, a soft shift toward understanding. When Veronica had confronted him with her clipboard and accusatory tone, it wasn't just a simple misunderstanding about property rights. It was a moment that laid bare the assumptions people carried, the unspoken biases that shaped interactions, and the fragile threads of respect that could snap with a few careless words. Leonard hadn't raised his voice, hadn't resorted to threats or anger. He had stood firm, letting the truth of his ownership and his father's legacy speak louder than any argument could. And that decision, to remain composed amidst the storm, had rippled far beyond the shoreline. In the weeks that followed, Leonard had been approached by neighbors he'd barely known before. Some, like Andrea Preston, stepped forward with offers of help and genuine apologies. Others simply nodded in his direction at the grocery store or paused during evening walks to say, "Thank you for standing up." It wasn't a flood of praise, and it wasn't always comfortable, but it was enough to remind Leonard that dignity was its own quiet victory. The new lake access agreement, now codified with clear terms, wasn't just a legal document, it was a symbol of restored balance. A commitment from the community to respect not only the land but the person behind it. But not everyone had come around. Leonard was acutely aware of the hushed whispers that still accompanied his visits to town. The sidelong glances from those unwilling to let go of old assumptions. Yet even in that, he found a strange sense of peace. He didn't need universal approval. He only needed to know he had done right by his father's memory and by the values instilled in him growing up by these waters. He had learned that the loudest voices weren't always the most enduring. And that real change often came not with fiery speeches but with steadfast, quiet actions that accumulated weight over time. That day by the lake, Leonard was joined by a small group: Andrea, Billy Waller and his grandson, and a few younger neighbors who had once been too intimidated to approach. They brought tools, trash bags, and quiet determination. Together, they repaired the old dock, cleared debris, and repainted faded railings. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was genuine. As they worked side by side, Leonard felt the tightness in his chest loosen, the lines between ownership and community blurring into something healthier, something more sustainable. As the sun dipped lower, casting long streaks of light over the water, Leonard found himself thinking back to his father's words. Respect isn't something you can demand. It's something you show up for, over and over, until it becomes part of the landscape. Today, those words rang truer than ever. The community, once divided by misunderstandings and entitlement, was beginning to remember how to listen. How to recognize not just ownership but stewardship. Leonard wasn't a man seeking power, he was a man protecting a legacy, a place, and an ideal. As he packed up his tools and watched the younger neighbors laugh and skip stones across the water, Leonard felt a quiet contentment settle over him. The fight wasn't over, and there would always be challenges. But today, the lake was his once more, not just by deed, but by the understanding that real respect is earned plank by plank, person by person. And in that moment, Leonard realized that sometimes the strongest way to lead was to stand still and let others catch up. In a world where entitlement often masks itself as authority, Leonard Thomas's quiet stand by Mayfield Lake became more than a battle over land. It became a profound lesson in dignity and resilience. That day, when Veronica Mitchell stormed up to him, clipboard in hand, her voice cutting through the morning air like a knife, Leonard could have fought back with anger, met her hostility with fire. But he didn't. He stayed calm, steady, letting the truth of his ownership and the history of his family's stewardship over the lake speak for itself. That choice, that stillness in the face of confrontation, wasn't weakness, it was strength. It was the kind of strength that doesn't need to shout to be heard. The kind that whispers, "I know who I am, and I don't need your validation to stand tall." In the days that followed, the ripples of Leonard's quiet defiance spread far and wide. Neighbors who once passed him by without a glance now offered nods of recognition. Small acts of solidarity that, though simple, spoke volumes. There were still whispers, still those unwilling to let go of their assumptions. But they no longer defined the narrative. Leonard's story wasn't just about a man and his lake. It was about how standing firm with grace can force an entire community to reckon with its own biases. To recognize the quiet, enduring power of respect. When Andrea Preston and others stepped up, offering to help, to rebuild both the lake's physical structures and the fractured trust of the neighborhood. It wasn't just an apology, it was a step toward healing. Toward understanding that true ownership isn't just about deeds and documents, but about the relationships we nurture, That's the heart of this story. The emotional truth that lingers long after the last line of a letter or the final hammering of a nail. It's about how we choose to respond when faced with ignorance or injustice. Do we shout, escalate, and mirror the anger thrown our way? Or do we stand firm, grounded in truth and respect, showing that dignity is a force far stronger than rage? Leonard's choice reminds us that the battles worth fighting are often won not with words, but with actions, with the quiet rebuilding of a dock, the patient explanation of a legacy, the willingness to meet anger with calm. So, here's the lesson I hope stays with you long after you finish reading this. Respect isn't granted because of a title or a position. It's earned through patience, consistency, and integrity. When someone tries to diminish you, when they look at you and see only what they assume, remember that your worth isn't defined by their ignorance. It's defined by your own understanding of your value, your history, and the quiet power you hold in simply standing tall. And if you ever feel overlooked, underestimated, or silenced, think of Leonard Thomas by Mayfield Lake. Think of how his silence spoke louder than accusations, how his dignity resonated stronger than any argument. If this story moved you, if it made you reflect on your own moments of standing up or staying silent, I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments below. Your voice matters here, just as much as Leonard's did on that dock. And if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel. There are more stories like this waiting to be told. Stories of real people, quiet heroes, and the lessons that shape us all. Let's keep the conversation going. Let's keep listening, learning, and, above all, standing with dignity.